Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Shapira, and we are making a space opera. Today, gender and science fiction from the 1960s to the 1980s. In the late 1960s and 70s, the exploration of gender and science fiction went into the hypersphere, especially compared to all that had come before it. This was led mostly by two factors. The social upheaval going on in the surrounding culture, which was questioning everything that had come before and causing young writers to take daring, crazy, even drug-fueled leaps in creativity, and even more importantly, a new wave of female authors who were talented, creative, and itching to tackle gender issues, and increasingly informed by discussions occurring in feminist writings of the time, which themselves were beginning to discuss concepts of gender in wider terms, even as being distinctive from sex. More so, some of them were willing to publish stories under their own name as opposed to a male-sounding pseudonym, unthinkable up until that time. Now, to be fair, back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there were some women authors operating in the overwhelmingly male-dominated field of sci-fi, but they had to write under pseudonyms. While male-sounding pseudonyms did not disappear anytime soon and even survive today, there were top-notch talents fueled by second-wave feminism who not only published great works of sci-fi and fantasy, but did so under their own name. Ursula K. Le Guin, Joanna Russ, Marge Piercy, Anne McCaffrey, Marion Zimmer Bradley, that's a nasty little hornet's nest right there, but her fantasy and sci-fi works were seminal achievements back in the day. James Tiptree Jr. was an excellent and influential writer and was the pseudonym of Alice Hastings Bradley. Suddenly, after decades where even alien races have the same sex and gender roles as humans, we get stories with single-gender societies, androgynous societies. A popular new trope amongst this new wave of women writers was to depict societies without men, free from notions of patriarchy and with utopian overtones. The Female Man by Joanna Russ presents a culture called While Away, which became entirely female after a plague killed all the men, a trope carried down today in works such as Y the Last Man by Brian Vaughan and Pia Guerra, as well as Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin. Boy, you want a dark dystopian tale of survival that has an edge. Check out Manhunt. It's a ride and a half. Walk to the End of the World by Susie McKee Charnas is a messed up tale where a barbaric, post-plague, all-male society keeps women as something between slaves and pets and treats them as far less than human, although there exists an underground resistance of these femmes who will rise up. Woman on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy has a woman suffering under life in 1970s New York who is visited by an emissary from 2137 whose future is a solar punk utopia where gender distinctions, racial disharmony, and class separation have largely vanished, and presents her with a crossroads leading either to this bright future or to a dystopia of classism, misogyny, homophobia, and cruel violence. The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin tells of an alien ambassador from an enlightened confederation of planets where gender has largely been transcended, who has come to convince a less mature society of why joining them is the sensible way forward. Women writers weren't alone in exploring gender barriers. Samuel Delany, another titan of science fiction, was a gay black man, openly gay in the 70s, which deserves a nod of respect in itself, published Triton in 1976. Subtitled An Ambiguous Heterotopia as a direct response to Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed and Ambiguous Utopia, it follows a shallow asshole named Bronwyn from Mars who comes to live in the Neptunian utopia of Triton. Triton is fluid and progressive with a high degree of self-modification, so that one can change one's physical appearance, sex, gender, sexual orientation, and even specific patterns of likes and dislikes. The man cannot adjust and cannot form meaningful relationships with women who live in this world. Eventually, the protagonist becomes a woman, although it's not so much for transgender positive reasons as it is an act of extreme narcissism, as Bronwyn hopes to finally be the kind of woman who could love the type of man she was. Michael Moorcock used gender fluidity. His character of Jerry Cornelius switches sexually between male and female repeatedly during his psychedelic journeys. It's important to note that some of these writers were drawing from feminist literature of the 70s, which was talking about concepts of gender being tied to socialization, not biological sex. This will become very important going forward, and we will get into this in just a few minutes. Books and literature are always at the frontier of cultural thought. Movies and TV being more populist, less so. Female roles in sci-fi movies were overwhelmingly still as the damsel in distress, although some weirder outliers were occurring. Barbarella is a weird, horny 25 milligram edible of a science fiction movie. Jane Fonda's lead is too exploited and sex-kitteny to take seriously, but it is a romp that would never have been possible in the 50s. Stepford Wives had some legit feminist criticism. On sci-fi TV, women were sidekicks and side characters. Think Doctor Who, the gem that was Blake Seven, or even Star Trek, where Uhura's presence as a black woman was a notable achievement, although nothing meaningful was ever done with her beyond her presence. It isn't until the end of the 70s we get two very significant and influential female roles in sci-fi film, Princess Leia in Star Wars and Ripley in Alien, both of which had immense impact. Queerness was still absent in sci-fi cinema until 1975, although there was plenty of queer coding. Most queer coding in cinema exists in films that aren't particularly sci-fi related, and indeed, the history of queer cinema is a deep well, better served by more in-depth analysis than we're doing here in this specifically sci-fi journey. It is worth mentioning, though, the existence of the Hays Code. The Hays Code was a set of moral guidelines for American films from 1930 to 1966 that regulated content like violence, sex, and profanity. Created by Will H. Hays, the code was a form of self-censorship of Hollywood studios to avoid government oversight. It banned certain themes such as drug trafficking, mixed-race romance, mandated that crime should never pay, and absolutely forbid homosexuality or gender shenanigans. Suffice to say, any overt questioning of gender and sexuality is absent from sci-fi cinema up until 1975, when a single film lands like a nuclear bomb and creates a cultural explosion that is still discussed today, and indeed even looks back on 1950s sci-fi cinema with a queer eye. That film, whose impact can honestly not be overstated, is of course the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Whether the Rocky Horror Picture Show has aged well or not is not a discussion for right now. What is relevant is that Frankenfurter and Company was a midnight revolution, and the fact that it was so overt was in no small part responsible for its reception amongst an audience thirsty for queer representation mixed with outright musical bangers and sci-fi weirdness. It was a zeitgeist and ruled midnight theaters every weekend for literally years. Heck, at one point in my teenage years, I knew probably about 90% of the audience callbacks by heart, the audience callbacks being an odd fan-created canon. It is worth noting that Frankenfurter refers to himself as transsexual, which was a broader blanket term that prefaced transgender and carried a lot less nuance. While multiple indigenous peoples had words for a third sex, and the concept of gender differentiating from sex was discussed in limited and highly specialized circles back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the English word transsexual first appears in 1949, coined by David Oliver Caldwell, who was inspired by the 1923 German term transsexualismus from German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld. In 1955, sexologist John Money, working for Johns Hopkins, coined the term gender role to describe the public expression of one's gender based on a person's attitudes and behaviors. His work was extremely influential and sets the stage for our current understanding of gender versus sex. However, it would take decades for it to seep out into popular culture. As a personal aside, I have some very serious misgivings about some of John Money's theories and practices, and very serious distaste, and you should look up the story of David Raymer, the larger discussion of which is beyond the scope of this dumb little video. In 1965, Dr. John F. Olivan first used transgender as a synonym for transsexual, though it lacked its modern meaning. However, Virginia Prince adopted the term transgender in 1969 to create a distinction between transsexuals who undergo surgery and herself, a heterosexual cross-dresser who lives socially as a woman full-time without surgery. In the 1970s, feminism began discussing the distinction between sex and gender in earnest. Anne Oakley's 1972 book, Sex, Gender, and Society, was pivotal in transforming gender into a critical analytical tool for exploring how social rules and expectations, rather than biology, shape men and women's lives. And Gail Rubin's 1975 essay, The Traffic in Women, introduced the influential expression sex-gender system to describe the social mechanisms that transform biological sexuality into social constructs. As these discussions picked up steam across feminist literature, they would slowly seep out into the larger popular culture. It was the 1990s when the term transgender finally began replacing transsexual in popular culture, although slowly. And with it, the discussion of distinctions between sex and gender seep out beyond feminist academia and the medical field. Meanwhile, back in the 1980s, we move into a Reagan era of hypermasculinity, and women still being regulated to the doting damsel. But even so, things move forward. In music, androgyny becomes heavily utilized, and writers like Octavia Butler and Margaret Atwood emerge, towering talents who create masterpieces and win awards, making scathing swaths of sci-fi literature with bold usages of feminism and race and their dystopian cautionary tales. Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis series deals with an alien race who wishes to save humanity by having surviving humans interbreed with the alien's third sex to create a new race of human-alien hybrids that will not only be genetically more able to thrive on Earth's current form, but alleviate some of humanity's more destructive behaviors and tendencies. Writers like Tabitha Lee and Martin Gardner continued to explore societies with alternatives to binary gender. Indeed, during the 80s and the spaces outside of the corporate mainstream, alternative voices, queer voices, nonconformist, and post-punk voices were producing vast outpourings of art and developing alternative publishing machines. In literature, comics, music, zines, anywhere you look, these will grow until the 90s becomes a virtual golden age of alternative publishing. Feminist publishers, such as the Women's Press in London, created specific science fiction imprints during the 80s and 90s to publish queer and experimental works that major publishers would not touch, helping to promote a diverse range of voices and ideas. Connie Willis, Lisa Turtle, Pat Cadigan, Joan Slozecki, Linda Naggett, Pat Murphy, Mary Gentle, Jade Carr, the list goes on, were all writers who achieved some measure of success in the 80s, making science fiction that explored sex and gender outside of patriarchal standards. In the 90s, cyberpunk will hit, and the internet will begin to rear its head, initially a thing of possibility and potential, long before the hellscape of social media propaganda, brainwashing, and recursive bubbles of vulgar ignorance that it has become. Next time, we will conclude with sci-fi in the internet age, when experimentation with gender bursts open into the kaleidoscopic world that it is today, much to the chagrin of conservative and alt-right culture, who, both shocked and threatened by it, has instigated increasingly rabid, violent, and virulent campaigns of censorship, persecution, and retribution. That's it for today. We will see you next time. Catchphrase, living la vida loca. Huh? No. Okay. Work in progress. Cheers.